Okay, we're about to enter the main event, the first half of the main event, and for that I'll call on, let me introduce Helen Nathan, who will introduce our first speaker. So Helen is a partner, is a lawyer, a partner at Coleman Yovanovitch Koester. She's the legal counsel of our parish here and serves on the advisory committee of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center that George is running with Telly. And also, Dr. John is also on the same advisory committee. So we have two advisors sitting right next to George here that I'm watching him. So, Helen.
It'll be three at the end of the day.
Oh, my God. Go
ahead, Helen. Welcome, Helen. God
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to introduce the first speaker, George Demacopoulos. George is the Father John Meyendorff and Patterson Family Chair of the Orthodox Christian Studies at Fordham University in New York City. He is a professor of historical theology at Fordham. His research and teaching interests are in the fields of early Christian and Byzantine church history, and he specializes in the relationship between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches during the Middle Ages. George is a prolific author, having written and edited many books and articles. His latest book is Colonizing Christianity, Greek and Latin Religious Identity in the Era of the Fourth Crusade. The book is published by Fordham University Press, 2019. George and Aristotle Papanikolaou, known as Telly, recently edited a volume entitled Fundamentalism or Tradition, Christianity After Secularism, also published by Fordham University Press, 2019. George is a Tennessee native and came to Fordham in 2002 after receiving his PhD and master's in religious studies at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He also has a master's in theological studies from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in Brookline, Massachusetts, and a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Tennessee. Along with Telly, George co-founded and now co-directs Fordham's Orthodox Christian Studies Center. The center is the only research university center of Orthodox Christianity in the United States. It facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarly work related to Orthodox Christianity and its various jurisdictions. On behalf of the center, Telly and George have won many prestigious grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Henry Luce Foundation, the British Council, and Leadership 100. George is also an archon of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, officium designation Didaskalos tou Genus, meaning teacher of the people. This is George's second lecture here at St. Catherine's. George, welcome back.
Wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you. That's quite the introduction. Let me begin with my thank yous to Father Philemon, who I've known for a few years now, and I'm so inspired by Dr. Harry and by everyone else, for the archons, for this stunning turnout. I know you're all here for Lauren, so I'll stay on time. All right. It's okay. You know, when you get invited to do these kinds of talks, a lot of times people just give you your topic without letting you pick, and that's what happened to me today. So Dr. Harry said, you know what I really want you to talk about? I want you to talk about the future of Orthodox Christian unity in the United States. And I don't know, this was 6 months ago. I said, yeah, sure, no problem. And I didn't really give any thought to it until, you know, a couple weeks ago. And as I started to prepare, I realized there is absolutely nothing of substance I can say about this that won't upset half of the room, right? So I'm going to begin by apologizing for upsetting you, right? Because I'm sure I will upset you in very different ways over the next few minutes. And you'll hear about it. Yes, and I'll hear about it, yes. I get lots of hate mail. So now I realize not everybody in the room is an Orthodox Christian, or even if you are, that you're necessarily a Greek Orthodox Christian. You're here because you're concerned about issues of religious freedom. So let me take just a minute to explain why the unity of Orthodox Christians in America actually has direct bearing on the cause of religious freedom around the globe. Okay? The very language of religious freedom was born in the middle of the 20th century, and it was born out of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which contained elements within it about the protection of religious minorities in countries that had oppressive regimes. All right? And at the time, those spaces, and it remains the case today, those spaces where Christians are religious minorities within authoritative regimes are in places in the Middle East primarily, but also North Africa, where Orthodox Christianity is the dominant, if not the only, expression of Christianity that exists. All right, so those of you who may not be Orthodox, you may not realize this, but when we talk about the persecution of Christians in Egypt or in Iraq or in Syria or in Lebanon or in Turkey, we are principally talking about the persecution of Orthodox Christians broadly understood. Okay? So the Christians that we're talking about across the globe that are suffering these ways are in theological communion, or at least adjacent to those in theological communion, with the Chalcedonian Orthodox Christians in the United States. Now, if you know anything about Orthodox Christianity, you know that it's old, it has traditions, it has priests, it has icons, it has sacraments, right? And in many ways, it looks like the Roman Catholic Church in terms of its ritual practices and its confessional understanding. But it is organized very, very differently. All right, the Roman Catholic Church is organized kind of like a monarchy, right? It's born in the Middle Ages and so forth. Whereas the Orthodox Church has, at least since the 4th century, since the legalization of Christianity, operated in a different kind of model with religiously united, theologically united, but separately self-governed jurisdictional bodies. All right, the fancy word, everybody, no one is too old to learn new words. I'm going to teach you a new word today. It's called autocephaly, right? It means self-governance, all right? So in the Orthodox world, and there are about 300 million in the Orthodox world, in the Orthodox world writ large, depending on how you count, there are either 14, 15, or 16, because it's disputed, autocephalous churches, which means there are 14, 15, or 16 self-governing churches in the Orthodox world that are all in theological communion with one another. People can go from one church to the other and receive the sacrament, serve as a best man, baptize a child, what have you. But they're completely self-governed differently. Now, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople is the historic first among equals. So when the leaders of these communities come together, the ecumenical patriarch has pride of place. And he certainly has a position of power, and he can represent global orthodoxy in a way that no other figure can, but he doesn't have administrative authority outside of his own jurisdiction. Okay, so that's just a little of the background. Another important thing to know about the background, because it helps to explain the dysfunction of American Orthodoxy, and I don't mind saying that word, right, is that historically, and this goes back to the Byzantine Empire, you had this notion of self-governing churches within a common empire, a political space, but the boundaries of those jurisdictional breaks had absolutely nothing to do with ethnicity or language. The boundaries that separated the Church of Alexandria from the Church of Jerusalem, from the Church of Antioch, what have you, They simply mirrored one-to-one the way that the Romans subdivided their provinces for the raising of taxes and the movement of armies. There was absolutely nothing linked to language or ethnography, right? It didn't factor into the equation. But as the church has evolved over time, and especially after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, the ancient principle of self-governing churches began to be appropriated by emergent nation states. So that you now had a self-governing Church of Greece, which was completely distinctive from the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople, literally 30 miles away, which was separate from the Church of Bulgaria, which was separate from the Church of Serbia, which was separate from the Church of Romania, and on and on and on. So today, the majority of those self-governing churches map geographically onto nation states with different languages, cultures, what have you. So you have this ancient tradition of self-governing churches, but in the modern world it has taken on these added cultural nationalistic identities. And in the modern world, you no longer have a united empire, right? That when push comes to shove, you have a single political leader who can force the independent churches to the table. That happened in Byzantium all the time. It's impossible to occur today. All right, so where does this get us with the United States? Orthodoxy came to the United States first in a small kind of way through evangelism in Alaska by the Russian Orthodox. But then more recently and more prominently through migration of people coming from Eastern Europe and the Middle East to American shores, establishing communities which were in many ways designed to help shelter and protect communities in an unknown land with different language, different culture, where they were subject to persecution, bias, discrimination, and so forth. And so the churches in the United States, whether they were Greek or Russian or Serbian or Arab, were largely, it was very hard to differentiate between culture and religion. Right, they created a kind of microcosms of a kind of little Greece or a little Serbia or a little Antioch or what have you, a little Cairo, right, across the United States. And they all just kind of grew on their own, and they were mostly inward-looking. There was some evangelism, some noted evangelism, but it was principally inward-looking. I'm going to pause for a second to explain the Russian situation, because the Russian situation is the most unique in the United States, and because in some ways it points to what could possibly be in terms of a united, like bringing all these people together under the same jurisdiction in the United States. All right. When much of this was going on, in the early 20th century, in Russia, you had something completely different going on. You had the Bolsheviks, you had communism, and so forth. And so a lot of the Christian intellectuals fled Russia. First they went to Paris, and then they came to the United States. And the church in Russia basically became an agency of the KGB. And so even though they were Soviets and they were atheists and so forth, they actually kept the church alive. But it became an agency of the KGB, it became an agency of the state and so forth. And so the Christians who fled to the United States, the Russians who fled to the United States, were all kind of upside down about what to do about this situation. Many of them wanted to break communion with the church in Russia because they felt like it had apostatized. But abroad and before modern communication and so forth, they couldn't agree on they couldn't agree about how to resist what was going on in Russia. And the Russians in the United States splintered into many different groups. Okay? If you know anything about church history, you know that from the time of the New Testament, Christians have been splintering. right? If you read the New Testament, we have Hank here who can tell us better than anyone, right? If you read the New Testament carefully, you know that even in the New Testament era, there was always the temptation for fragmentation. That people understood the life and mission of Jesus in slightly different ways, or they thought that the church should be ruled in slightly different ways. And there's always been this pull towards fragmentation, and yet the apostles are constantly telling us, be one, be one, be one. And the apostles are always telling us that because it's really hard and we need to be reminded. And so the Russians in the United States in the 20th century were in this situation where there were 3 or 4 different groups. And a very pioneering priest, the person for whom my endowed chair at Fordham is actually named, Father John Meyendorff, a great intellectual historian who taught at a seminary called St. Vladimir's in New York. He also taught at Fordham. He was part of the brain tank that actually put together the idea that because of the communist situation in Russia, because of the fragmentation of the church in the United States, we should have a single united Orthodox Church of America. And we should just come to terms with the fact that we are in the United States, our children are speaking English, they are marrying Americans, and we should have a single united church, and we're going to jettison, or at least distance ourselves from what's going on in Russia, and we're going to create our own church, and we're going to move entirely to English. And this happened. It was the Orthodox Church of America. And there was a lot of promise, and there was a lot of excitement, and there was a lot of fear. There were very, very tense negotiations between Archbishop Iakovos, who is the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese at the time. He was young at the time. And the leaders at St. Vladimir's who engineered this. And they came this close to going into permanent sacramental schism with one another. But Archbishop Iakovos had a great deal of respect for Father Meyendorff, and Father Meyendorff had a great deal of respect for Archbishop Iakovos. And I actually, in my office, I have a picture of Father Meyendorff, Archbishop Iakovos, and Father Alexander Schmemann, who is another one of these leaders at St. Vladimir's, and they're all celebrating the liturgy together. Because they realized that in prayer and unity, the church should be together. So what the formation of the OCA achieved was it brought together most of this fragmentation within the Russian church. Not all of it, but it brought together most of the fragmentation within the Russian church. And it introduced a very viable English language vehicle for converts to Orthodoxy to ease their way into the church. What it did not achieve was it did not actually achieve what it had aspired to do, which was to bring the Russians, the Serbian, or the other Russians, the Serbians, the Greeks, the Antiochians along. And so since the 1960s, you've had this church called the OCA, the Orthodox Church of America, which grew out of the Russian church, really the 70s, which grew out of the church, which grew out of the Russian church. You've had the Greeks, you've had the Antiochians, you've had the Serbians, you've had the Romanians, and so forth. So almost all of the self-governing churches abroad, almost all, have their own jurisdictions in the United States. The Greeks are the largest, the Greek Orthodox Church of America, and it is basically, I'm going to use rough numbers, it is basically the size of all of the others put together. Okay. You also have a growing Serbian church because you have growing migration. As it happens, there's a Serbian bishop he's a wonderful man, Bishop Iranej, who serves on our board at Fordham. He's a magnificent man, right? You have the Antiochians, which historically are Arab Orthodox, right, from Syria. Interestingly enough, in the 1980s, late 1980s, a group of evangelicals who are behind the whole campus crusade movement for Christ, a large group of evangelical ministers went to the Patriarch of Alexandria and received his blessing for them to bring all of their parishes en masse into Orthodoxy. And it was rather controversial at the time because the priests themselves did not then go through a rite of ordination. And many of them did not go through Or maybe some of them did. But it was very controversial about the way that this occurred. And so today, I'm going to jump forward because I know people are going to have some questions and I have some provocative suggestions. That's what I do, right? I'm going to jump ahead, but today you have a situation, if we're going to talk real numbers, where the size of the Greek Orthodox Church in America en masse is shrinking. The size of the Orthodox Church in America en masse is shrinking. Right? I mean, these follow larger demographic trends in the U.S. among Christians. Right? The size of the Antiochian Church might actually be growing because they, more than anyone else, are really, really invested in evangelism. And they, like the OCA, maybe 20, 30 years ago, moved to all English. And so they're growing, right? They have, I believe the current number is that about 70 to 75% of the priests in the Antiochian church are themselves adult converts to Orthodoxy. Many of them coming from evangelical traditions, and they bring the kind of fire for mission with them into their ministry, and so they might be the only ones growing. The other one that might be growing is a group that I haven't talked about called the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Their legacy is they were part of the Russian fragmentation that did not go with the OCA. And they had broken themselves off from Moscow during the Cold War, but then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they realigned with Moscow. They are probably, at least in terms of the other jurisdictions, they are a growing jurisdiction today. They are also another site where a lot of converts are going, especially, ironically enough, in places like Appalachia. Actually, our current fellow at Fordham, our dissertation fellow at Fordham this year is actually writing, she's an anthropologist, and she went and lived among West Virginia coal miners who are converting to Russian Orthodoxy, right? It's just fascinating dynamic. So so the Greeks are larger than all of these others, okay? And there was some hope in the 80s that there really would be movement and everybody would come together and there might be some kind of Orthodox church, some united Orthodox American church that would itself ultimately become autocephalous, right? In the same way that you've had the emergence of autocephalous churches elsewhere. I think the momentum for that possibility is reversing. If I'm going to give an honest appraisal of the situation right now, there are a lot of different reasons for that. I think part of the problem is, well, there are a lot of problems. Among the problems is that each of the jurisdictions, Russia, or OCA, Antiochian, Serbian, ROCOR, Greek Orthodox, each of them they all say they want a united jurisdiction, but for every one of them, their vision of what that would look like is radically different. So I know, for example, the Antiochians and the OCA could not envision any scenario of a united Orthodoxy that long term was subservient to some church elsewhere. Neither the OCA or the Antiochian church to integrate would do that, right? I've spoken to bishops about this. I run in the circle where I know these people and I'm speaking with them and so forth. They have no interest in doing that. The Serbians, who I'm increasingly impressed by and close with, the Serbians, my sense is the Serbians are where the Greek community was 20 or 30 years ago in terms of it still being largely ethnically focused and largely inward looking. They're trying to get their feet before they're ready to look outward. Their bishops are appointed from Belgrade, right? They are part, like there isn't, the way the three Serbian bishops in the United States work, they aren't really even their own separate jurisdiction. They report directly to Belgrade. And so it's their vision is very different. I think the situation among the Greeks, if you talk to the bishops, you would probably get a similar kind of answer where they would like to see this, but they only envision it under the ecumenical patriarch. I'm personally in that camp, as you're going to hear in a minute. So in addition to all of these kind of structural issues in terms of the institutional church, bishops, chancellors, patriarchs, what have you, you have broader realities that challenge Orthodox unity in the United States. The Orthodox in the United States are far more diverse in what they think about everything than any of us in this room actually understand or imagine. Right? Orthodox Christians have every possible political idea under the sun, from absolute Marxist, from absolute Marxist to anarchist, to, I know some of these people, right? To absolute monarchists. Right? They're absolutely insistent that the only proper space for orthodoxy is under a czar. Right? And that anything less is some kind of capitulation to the world. Right? Orthodox Christians really do think in diverse ways. And in a space like America, that then means that they all get caught up in the same kind of culture wars that your friends at work or whatever get caught up in. Right? So there's more diversity among Orthodox Christians about their outlook on the world than we sometimes appreciate. And that too does get in the way of forging institutional unity. Right? Because it then demands statements about this, that, or the other thing that happens to be in the news at any given moment. You can't get the bishops to agree on these things, you can't get the laity to agree on these things, and so forth. That doesn't mean that they don't. One of the great things about Orthodox Christianity is that we don't really fight about doctrine. Right? Doctrine is, well, all right, Father. But doctrine is largely, like true doctrine, like what is the significance of the Trinity? What is the significance of Christology? What is the significance in the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Orthodox Christians don't fight about this. Right? We all subscribe to the same creed. We all subscribe to the same sacraments. We fight a lot about the details. But we don't fight about those big things, and that's actually really, really important. Okay? What would a future Orthodox, united Orthodox church look like, and why would it be good? Let me start with why it would be good. It would be good because, as the Apostle John writes in his letters at the end of the New Testament that nobody ever gets to, right? We just make it through the Gospels and Acts and then give up, right? But when we read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, we know unity is absolutely essential. Right? To be a Christian body means to share the Eucharist together in communion, to be one, that all might be one, and so forth. Right? From a pure theological perspective, it makes absolute sense that the Orthodox, let alone broader Christians, would all be unified. Pragmatically, for the issues that bring you to an event like this, the protection of Christians around the world, if you could have the Serbs, the Antiochians, the OCA, the Russians, and the Greeks on the same page jurisdictionally, they could speak with one voice to the State Department. They could speak with one voice to the President. They could speak with one voice to the EU. They could delineate specifically what the issues are in a way that we didn't have to dance around the competition between the Ecumenical Patriarch and the Patriarch of Moscow. Right? At Fordham, we literally get, I'm not making this up, we literally get calls from the State Department asking us to explain what's going on in the Orthodox world, because from the point of view of non-Orthodox in DC, they're completely baffled. right? And so one of the reasons I have a job, right, is to try and make sense of this for people. And I'm telling you, if we could be united institutionally, it would really help us with this kind of, concern. All right. Okay, I do want to have time for questions, so let me throw the fodder out there that's going to get you all really upset. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say some really hard numbers. And so my first recommendation is that we come to terms with the hard numbers. We recognize it and we deal with it. So the first hard number is a poll was taken of 30 and 40-year-olds who had been raised in the GOA, the Greek Orthodox Church of America. 54% of 30 and 40-year-olds who were polled said they no longer identify as Orthodox. 54% of 30 and 40-year-olds in the GOA who were baptized in the church, went to church occasionally, self-define as someone raised in the church, self-define as someone no longer Orthodox. That is a real number. Okay? Now, there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. There isn't a single reason for that. But that's a real number. Number two, about 90% of the weddings performed in the GOA over the last 15 years have been mixed marriages. Now, let that number sink in. I'm not talking about weddings performed in a Catholic church, or weddings performed in a Baptist church, or weddings performed on the beach. I'm talking about weddings that actually occur in the GOA. 90% are mixed. So that tells you about 98% are mixed. Okay? So my first recommendation is that we need to be aware of what is happening to our younger generations. Okay? If you think it's okay to just stay Greek or Serbian or Russian and not worry about it, your community is disappearing. These are real numbers. Okay? Number two, I can promise you, a lot of you are going to not like this. Number two, don't listen, Father. My recommendation is that the churches that are not already doing it, meaning the Greeks and the Serbians, need to move to all English liturgy as fast as possible. Right? It would be one thing if it was performed in modern Greek. I would have absolutely no problem with a liturgy performed in modern Greek in parishes where you have Greek speakers. The reality is, I have been studying ancient Greek for 30 years. I attend a parish with, used to be 600 families, now it's 400 families. I am the only person there that understands the hymns at Vespers. And I need a dictionary. Byzantine Greek is really hard. Right? Some of the vocabulary is the same. The grammar is nothing like modern Greek. Right? So that's my second recommendation. My third recommendation would be to merge, this is going to upset people too, would be to merge Holy Cross and St. Vladimir's. Now, if you're not familiar with them, Holy Cross is, well, there's Hellenic College, which is an accredited 4-year undergraduate college. On the same campus, there is a seminary that serves the GOA, and that's Holy Cross. St. Vladimir's is the premier seminary of the OCA. The OCA actually has 3 seminaries. St. Herman's in Alaska, St. Tikhon's, which is a very small school in Pennsylvania, and St. Vladimir's, which probably has the best academic history of all of the seminaries in the Western Hemisphere, Orthodox seminaries. So my recommendation would be to merge Holy Cross and St. Vladimir's. The cost savings alone would be astronomical. Both of these schools have about 100 students, right? So, individually. They both individually have about 100 students. St. Vladimir's might have a few less than that. So that would be, because, and there are a lot of important reasons for this. The cost savings is just one issue. It really would be the vehicle to bring about a broader unity in the United States. To have, like, you wouldn't actually have to merge the institutions, meaning the OCA and the Greeks and the Serbians or what. If you simply had a single premier seminary with adequate funding, because neither has adequate funding, with adequate funding, you could really, by training clergy together, you would have a kind of brotherhood of clergy that doesn't exist at the moment. I'm going to give you one anecdote really quick, and then we'll go to the questions. So I do what I do. I am a professor of history. I'm very involved with the archons. I'm very involved with the archdiocese. I've lived in the same house on Long Island for 16 years. I very dutifully go to the Greek church 2 miles to my north. I lived in this house for 14 years before I even knew that there was an OCA parish 2 miles to my south. I do what I do for a living, and I didn't even know there was an OCA parish 2 miles to my south. Because on Long Island, at least, there's absolutely zero interaction between the OCA, Antiochians, Rokor, what have you. Zero. Right? The only place, now maybe institutionally the bishops get together. I mean, they all come to our events at Fordham. We can get them together there. But, you know, anyway, my anecdote for American dysfunction. So my final recommendation is at least probably the least likely to happen. Well, none of them are likely to happen, but it's probably the one that would receive the most resistance, at least from people in other jurisdictions, but I'll explain why. And my recommendation would be that if there is ever going to be an administratively united Orthodox Church in America, the only way that it could work is under the leadership of the ecumenical patriarch. Right? There are some whispers that the OCA could find itself moving under the ecumenical patriarchate. One of the things that happened is that because when they broke off in the 1970s or formed their own church, it wasn't universally recognized by the others. So that's why I say, are there 14, 15, or 16 jurisdictions? They're the 15th, theoretically, right? And the new Ukrainian church is the 16th. The only way that it could work, at least as a stopgap, would be if everybody agreed to unite and to do so under the ecumenical patriarch. It's just the only way forward. The ecumenical what differentiates the ecumenical patriarch from the Patriarch of Moscow or the Patriarch of Serbia or the Archbishop of Athens or something like that is he doesn't speak for a national constituency. He has no country behind him, right? There are only 3,000 Orthodox Christians left in Turkey. Yeah, that's a real number, right? It's a nation of 80 million people. There are only 3,000 Orthodox Christians left, right? Nobody can presence or symbolically represent global orthodoxy the way the ecumenical patriarch can. So if there's going to be any vehicle for an eventual united church in America, the only feasible way it could happen would be, at least initially, under the leadership of the ecumenical patriarch, because only he has a canonical global jurisdiction. So I think I'll stop there and open for questions.
Please get to the microphone, sir.
Nice. Okay. I agree with you.
Stamati Artalopoulos from St. Mark, Boca Raton. I have one remark and two remarks to make. First, you mentioned that concerning freedom of religion was something that was generated back in the 20th century. I would like to just tell me if I'm wrong or right, that actually the freedom of religion was appeared first in history back in the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine the Great, with the Edict of Milan, stopped the persecutions of Diocletian and allowed Christianity to be a religion within the Roman Empire. And later, when the emperor moved to Constantinople, then of course everything became open and Christianity was...
You're absolutely right. No, I meant in a modern context.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Second, a program that's lacking within the Greek Orthodox Church, and I have experienced myself also, is that we do everything we do for our children when they are young. For instance, when they are in the age of 9, 10, 15, we have all these programs within the local churches, and when they are 18 and go to college, we forget them. They go to college, there's no contact anymore with the church unless they are nearby a church. For example, and I have lived that, as I said, my son was in Dartmouth. Dartmouth happens to be in the middle of New Hampshire, out in the woods. There's nothing out there. And my son would depend on me to go and visit him on a Sunday and to take him like 45 minutes away out in the woods to a small Russian church, just to go to church and communion. We had, in Dartmouth College, if you go any Sunday, any Saturday, any Friday.
Can we please go to the question show? There's a lot I see.
Okay, yeah, I'm finished. Thank you. I'm finishing up. I'm finishing up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that if you go to a college today, then you'll see a rabbi, you see a cardinal, you see from any other denomination but the Greek Orthodox priest there, to just keep them together. Thank you.
Yes, there is a national organization sponsored by the Assembly of Bishops called Orthodox Christian Fellowship, and most major universities have what you call OCF for the college students. But you're right that the program the institutional church across all jurisdictions is not dealing with its young adult population adequately. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Archon Elias Damanakis from Newport Richey. You did not disappoint. I look forward to the fodder on YouTube. I had one point of clarification. You mentioned that there's only 3,000 Orthodox Christians in Constantinople. I just want to clarify that. There's 3,000 Greeks.
Greeks, right.
But in the city of Constantinople, there's 30, 40, 50,000 Orthodox Christians under the ecumenical patriarchate. And in southern Turkey, there's one bishop that has 150,000. So the patriarchate in Turkey is growing. How do you think that implication of the Church of Turkey finding itself once again, becoming reborn, will affect the Greek Orthodox in America?
That's a good question. I guess I have to say I don't know. As you know very, very well, the political situation in Turkey is so volatile. I think it simply remains to be seen what life for Christians in Turkey is like, and the extent to which that then enables a future ecumenical patriarch to be involved or not involved in the church in America. I think that I don't think I can guess what's going to happen. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Archon Dr. Andreas Tsakis from Miami. I have two questions for you. Knowing the political climate not only in the church but around the world, would it be more practical to unite the different variants around certain causes like bombings in the Middle East? Number one, rather than try to unite the leadership, which I believe it is the first time it's going to happen ever.
Yeah.
The second question is, why is it a negative thing to have mixed marriages?
Right.
In my view, having mixed marriages, you include people that would have never been included otherwise to the faith.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both excellent questions. So the first one, you're proposing, does it not make more sense to form coalitions around issues of common concern? You are absolutely right. Now, what's interesting, or perhaps ironic, is that the ecumenical patriarch has actually been more successful in doing that with the Vatican in terms of violence against women, against war, in promotion of refugees, then he's been able to lobby other Orthodox jurisdictions to join him in these causes, right? But the way that it's working with Roman Catholics and other Christian communities obviously offers a model. You're absolutely right. I'd say you're also absolutely right. Yeah, I do teach at Fordham after all, that's right. I would say you're absolutely right that mixed marriages do not need to be a negative. And I'm the product of a mixed marriage, right? They absolutely have the possibility of bringing in an enormous number of people. The challenge is when the liturgy is in a language that nobody understands, right? And the community is more invested in cultural identity than Christian identity, then it throws up enormous barriers to the incoming spouse. And they're just not going to come. I mean, you will find the people who do, right? Some people are willing to overcome those cultural roadblocks. But in my experience, just observing what's gone on in my parish on Long Island for the last 15 years, you don't see them. You don't see them. Yeah.
Please.
The question is, do I know how many churches conduct the liturgy in Greek rather than English? I don't know. It's obviously more heavily Greek in places like New York, Boston, Chicago, and so forth. The further you get away from the metropolitan regions, the less it is. But my point is there shouldn't be any. I'm not excusing priests from learning ancient Greek so that they can interpret and preach about the texts. So you still have to learn it. I know you know it. I'm just saying the rest of us don't. Yeah. Carrie.
Dr. Demacopoulos. Carrie Limbarakis, Regional Commander from Philadelphia. I'm a son of a priest of 60 years. My dad served the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese for 60 plus years and then retired and then passed away about 9-10 years ago. I grew up in the church, hearing it only in Greek, that form of Greek that we call Byzantine or Church Greek. But if somebody approached me now and said, where do you stand on the Greek language and liturgy? I would say that when I die and I approach the pearly gates, St. Peter is not going to ask me to recite the creed in Greek. He's going to say, did you live the creed?
What concerns me, and I agree wholeheartedly with your recommendation number 3, that we should go to all English, what concerns me is that in our GOA, the Uniform Parish Regulations, and I've been on the parish council for decades, I've served as president, et cetera, all that. The UPR says that every parish, when it's formed and when you have elections, that part of that include the formation of a Greek language cultural school. Now, how many parishes across the country have Greek schools whose number of students outnumber the catechism schools? Should I say 100%? How many of the Greek schools are financed much more than the catechism schools? 100%? So my question is, George, at the next clergy laity, which metropolis is going to stand up and say, we need to delete that requirement because we need to spend more time on religious education than Greek language education? In the United States, Greek is not a second language. If we want to help our students, maybe we should teach Spanish. And I love my Greek heritage. Τα ελληνικά μου είναι σπασμένα. My grammar is terrible.
Right.
But I can get along in Greece.
Yeah.
So that's my question. How does that route take place? Thank you.
So your specific question, I think, was which metropolis is going to stand up and ask that? I'm going to answer that question because that's easy because it's none. Yeah.
Wait.
Can I say that? Okay.
Yeah.
Professor, you are a breath of fresh air. In fact, it's marvelous to be able to have you here today, coming from the great school of Fordham, doing exceptional work.
Thank you.
Would that your message be universally explored in the United States? The fact that you have such an important message to tell us. And of course, I don't see any of the hierarchy here present. And I don't know how we could get the word across to them that this is America, this is the U.S., we need a church of orthodoxy, Greek orthodoxy in America, and we need to use the English language.
Last question.
Yeah, okay, this is going to be the last one, sir.
Recent studies have revealed that church attendance has declined at least 33% over the past decade. I'm worried about Christianity in particular, but currently in other churches, I was shocked the split in the Methodist Church, for example, the problems that this bizarre Pope Francis, the Vatican has on Christianity in the world, and he's politicized his language in order, I think, to pretend to protect the bankruptcy that is impending in the Vatican treasury. And we also, Greeks, have our problems as well. But I'm shocked at what's happening in this country because of it.
Yeah. I'm not exactly sure if there's a question there. I'll simply, I will say that there are broader demographic shifts afoot in which the Orthodox are being caught up, right? Every single religious tradition, with the possible exception of the Pentecostals, is shrinking. Every one of them. And it's, it's a bit of a wake-up call. For us to sort of ask ourselves, why are we here? What are we doing? What is it that we are going to bequeath to our children and grandchildren? And, how are we going to live like Christians? It's that simple. Yeah. Thank you.
May I please?
Can you see him after, at the end of this session, please? Thank you. So, thank you, Dr. George, and I subscribe to everything you said about English, and mixed marriage is a very positive thing. It's a miracle, as the Archbishop has told us. Mixed marriages are a miracle. So thank you for that.